What if everything you thought you knew about women in Nazi Germany was wrong? The story we tell about women in the Third Reich tends to follow a familiar shape. Complicity and silence, domesticity weaponized as ideology, wives who looked away, daughters who waved flags, guards who committed atrocities in the death camps. It is a story rooted in uncomfortable truth, but it is not the whole story. Because somewhere in the wreckage of the Third Reich, there exists one woman who defies every category we might reach for. A woman who was not a passive bystander, but an active participant, not in crimes, but in extraordinary feats of skill and courage. A woman who was feted by the Nazi regime, and yet, when its darkest hour came, chose not to flee into hiding or deny what she had witnessed, but to fly directly into the burning center of it all, into the very ruins of Berlin itself. Her name was Hanna Reitsch. And by almost any measure, she is the opposite of every female Nazi. In this video, we will explore how this remarkable and deeply contradictory woman became Germany's greatest female pilot, what she actually did during the war, how she survived its end, and what she went on to do in the decades that followed. Her story is one of the most extraordinary in the entire history of the Second World War. So, without further ado, let's begin. To understand Hanna Reitsch, you have to start with the world she was born into. She came into the world on March 29, 1912, in the Silesian city of Hirschberg, which today lies within the borders of Poland and is known as Jelenia Góra. Hirschberg sat nestled in the foothills of the Riesengebirge, the giant mountains, a landscape of forested slopes and dramatic ridges that seemed almost designed to inspire dreams of flight. Hanna's father, Willy Reitsch, was an ophthalmologist, a man of education and some standing in the community. Her mother, Emmy, came from a similarly respectable background. The family was religious, conservative, and deeply rooted in the traditions of German middle-class life. There was nothing in this provincial setting to predict what Hanna would become. But from a very young age, she was consumed by a single obsession. She wanted to fly. This was not a passing fancy. It was a ferocious, all-consuming desire that shaped every decision she would ever make. As a child, she would spend hours watching birds, studying the way they rode thermals and banked on currents of air. She pestered her parents relentlessly. Her father, Willy, was initially resistant. Flying was dangerous, he pointed out, and it was not a suitable pursuit for a young woman. He had plans for Hanna. She would study medicine, like him, and become a doctor. For a time, Hanna appeared to comply. She was not by nature a rebellious child, and she loved her parents deeply. But the sky called to her in a way that medicine never could. As she grew older, the compromise she struck with her father was characteristically pragmatic. She agreed to study medicine, and she did, briefly enrolling at the Deutsche Akademie in Berlin. But she made her father agree that she could also pursue flying training. The moment she sat in a glider for the first time, everything else fell away. Gliding was in many ways the perfect entry point for Hanna Reitsch. In the years following Germany's defeat in the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles had imposed severe restrictions on German aviation. The country was forbidden from operating powered military aircraft of any consequence, but gliders fell into a grey area. As a result, gliding had become a national sport of sorts in the Weimar Republic, a way for young Germans to experience the skies without technically violating the treaty. Gliding clubs sprang up across the country, and it was within this world that Hanna first found her calling. She had an exceptional natural talent. She was also, from the beginning, utterly fearless. Fear was not something Hanna Reitsch seemed to experience in the conventional way. Her instructors noticed this quickly. Where other students grew tense when a glider bucked or stalled, Hanna seemed to grow calmer, more focused, more alive. She trained at the Grunau Soaring School in 1931, and her progress was remarkable. She moved through the preliminary licenses quickly and began entering competitions. The world of competitive soaring in early 1930s, Germany was dominated by men, and yet Hanna was soon beating many of them. She set records, accumulated certificates, and began to attract attention from the wider aviation community. In 1932, still only 20 years old, she completed the requirements for the Sea Glider certificate, a significant achievement for any pilot and extraordinary for someone her age. She was developing a reputation not just as a talented aviator, but as someone with an unusual capacity to perform under pressure, to troubleshoot problems in the air with a cool intelligence that belied her years, and she was determined to push further, always further. Her path to powered aviation came through an unexpected route. In 1933, she enrolled at the German Research Institute for Gliding, known by its German initials as the DFS, based at Darmstadt. The DFS was one of the leading aeronautical research organizations in Germany, and working there exposed Hanna to some of the finest engineering and flying minds of the era. She began conducting research flights, testing the aerodynamic properties of gliders at extreme altitudes and in challenging conditions. This work required not just flying skill but a scientific sensibility, the ability to observe precisely, to record data under duress, and to make sense of what the aircraft was telling her. Hanna excelled at it. She published articles in aviation journals. She lectured at technical conferences. She was, in short, becoming a serious figure in German aviation, not merely a curiosity or a novelty act, but someone whose judgment and expertise were genuinely valued. It was her research work that first brought her to Africa. In 1934, the Deutsches Forschungsinstitut für Segelflug sent her to South America for a series of research flights. She flew in Brazil, studying thermals over the tropical rainforest and the Atlantic coast, experiencing conditions quite unlike anything she had encountered in Europe. The flights were revelatory. She encountered weather systems of an intensity and unpredictability that tested every skill she possessed. She returned to Germany with new data, new experiences, and an expanded sense of what aviation could mean. She was also developing an international profile. German aviation in the mid-1930s was flourishing, powered by the money and ambition of the new Nazi regime, and Hanna Reitsch was becoming one of its most visible faces. The question of Hanna Reitsch's relationship with National Socialism is one of the most complex and debated aspects of her story. She joined the Nazi Party, though the exact date and the degree of her political engagement remain subjects of historical discussion. What is clear is that she was not, by temperament or inclination, a political animal. The evidence suggests she was primarily motivated by a passion for aviation and a powerful German nationalism, rather than by ideological commitment to Nazism in its most vicious forms. She appears to have genuinely believed in Germany's greatness and in the transformative power of aviation as a symbol and expression of that greatness. She did not, by most accounts, dwell on the anti-Semitism at the core of Nazi ideology. This is not to exculpate her from the moral burden of the associations she made and the regime she served. It is simply to say that her motivations were those of a passionate aviator and patriot, rather than those of a true ideological believer of the Goebbels stamp. But those motivations led her to places and actions that cannot be considered in isolation from the crimes of the regime she represented. By the mid-1930s, the new Nazi government was investing heavily in German aviation, both civil and military. The Luftwaffe was being rebuilt in open defiance of Versailles, and aviation was being celebrated as a quintessentially German achievement, a symbol of national renewal and technological superiority. Hanna Reitsch fitted perfectly into this narrative. She was talented, charismatic, photogenic, and utterly committed. She became one of the most prominent figures in the German aviation world, giving demonstrations, setting records, and appearing in the press as an exemplar of what the new Germany could produce. In 1937, she was appointed as a test pilot at the German Gliding Research Institute in Darmstadt, a prestigious and demanding role that placed her at the cutting edge of German aeronautical development. Her work as a test pilot is where Hanna Reitsch's story becomes genuinely astonishing. Test flying in the 1930s was extraordinarily dangerous. Aircraft were experimental, their limits unknown, their failure modes poorly understood. Men died regularly, doing the work that Hanna was now undertaking routinely. She tested new glider designs, pushing them to their structural limits and beyond. She flew in conditions deliberately designed to be dangerous because understanding how an aircraft failed was as important as understanding how it performed. She demonstrated a helicopter indoors at the Berlin Motor Show in February 1938, hovering the Fokker Achilles FW-61 inside the Deutschlandhalle with extraordinary precision, a feat that was both a demonstration of her skill and a piece of brilliant Nazi propaganda. The footage of this performance circulated widely and cemented her fame. She was, by this point, one of the most famous women in Germany. What made Hanna Reitsch so extraordinary as a pilot was not merely her skill, though that was exceptional, but her relationship to fear and risk. She seems to have possessed a psychological constitution quite unlike most human beings. Where others experienced rising panic in moments of airborne crisis, Hanna experienced something closer to heightened clarity. She described this herself in her memoir, recalling moments of acute danger where time seemed to slow and her thinking became unusually precise. Whether this was a genetic gift, a product of rigorous training, or some deeper psychological characteristic, it made her an invaluable test pilot. She could fly an aircraft to the point of catastrophic failure and still bring it home, or at least survive the attempt. She was injured more than once in crashes that would have killed other pilots. But she kept flying. In 1938, she became the first woman to fly a helicopter, though the honour is sometimes contested depending on the definition of a helicopter flight. More significantly, she was one of the first people anywhere in the world to demonstrate sustained, controlled helicopter flight before a large audience. This was not a minor achievement. The helicopter was then a very new technology, unpredictable and physically demanding to fly in a way that powered fixed-wing aircraft were not. The Fokker Achilles FW-61 required constant small corrections and had a tendency to respond dramatically to any input error. That Hanna flew it indoors in the confined space of a large arena with thousands of spectators watching was a demonstration of nerve and precision that left aviation professionals genuinely stunned. Charles Lindbergh, one of the most celebrated aviators in the world, was among those who were deeply impressed by her abilities. The year 1939 brought both a major achievement and the shadow of the coming catastrophe. Hanna Reitsch set a new women's world altitude record for helicopters. She was flying regularly with the DFS, testing an ever wider range of experimental aircraft. She was also serving as a demonstration pilot, flying before foreign dignitaries and aviation officials as part of Germany's effort to project an image of technological superiority. And then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world changed. The war that followed would eventually transform Hanna Reitsch's career, her country, and her understanding of everything she had believed in. The early years of the war brought Hanna even further into the orbit of the German military establishment. She was assigned to test aircraft for the Luftwaffe, work that was even more dangerous than her pre-war research flying. She tested the Dornier Du-17, the Heinkel He-111, and a range of other military aircraft, pushing them to their limits and identifying weaknesses before they reached frontline service. She was also involved in the development of glider towing techniques, testing the procedures by which large military gliders like the DFS-230 could be extracted from difficult terrain after landings, a problem that had proved costly in the early airborne operations of the war. Her work on the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was particularly demanding, involving deliberate high-speed dives to determine structural stress limits. In 1941, she received one of the most coveted military decorations in Germany. On March 28, 1941, Adolf Hitler personally presented Hanna Reitsch with the Iron Cross Second Class for her test flying work. She was only the second woman to receive this decoration during the entire course of the war. The first had been Melita von Stauffenberg, a fellow test pilot whose own story intersects with Hanna's in fascinating and complicated ways. The Iron Cross Award was significant not just as a personal honour but as a public statement. Hitler was signalling that Hanna Reitsch occupied a special place in the Nazi aviation establishment, that her contributions were valued at the highest level. She met Hitler in person for the first time around this period, and the encounter made a powerful impression on her. She found him compelling, magnetic in the way that many who met him did, though the nature and depth of her admiration for him is another contested dimension of her story. The work that would define Hanna Reitsch's war years and the work that most clearly illustrates her difference from the women we typically associate with the Nazi regime came in 1942 and 1943 when she became involved in some of the most extraordinarily dangerous test flying ever undertaken. She was asked to test the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a rocket-powered aircraft that was unlike anything that had ever flown. The Me-163 was powered by a Walter HWK 509 rocket motor, burned a lethal combination of methanol, hydrazine hydrate, and concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and was capable of climbing at a rate that contemporary pilots found almost impossible to comprehend. It was also spectacularly dangerous. The propellants were so corrosive that spills could dissolve a pilot within seconds. The airframe was prone to structural failures. Several pilots died testing it, and Hanna Reitsch flew it. She was seriously injured during a test flight of the Me-163 in 1942. The aircraft's undercarriage collapsed on landing, the cockpit was crushed, and Hanna sustained devastating injuries including a fractured skull, broken jaw, shattered nose, and severe head trauma. She was in hospital for 5 months. The injuries were so severe that some of her colleagues doubted she would ever fly again, and many questioned whether she would fully recover neurologically. But she did recover, and she did fly again. Her survival was remarkable. Her determination to return to the cockpit after such trauma speaks to a depth of commitment to flying that went beyond anything that can be explained by professional ambition or patriotic duty. This was a woman for whom the sky was, quite simply, where she belonged. During her long recovery, she dictated notes on her flying experiences, the basis of what would later become her memoir. She also remained connected to the aviation world, receiving colleagues at her bedside and insisting on being kept informed of developments in the test program. By early 1943, she was back in the cockpit. She returned to test flying with an intensity that alarmed some of those around her. The injuries had not diminished her abilities. If anything, the colleagues who flew with her in the recovery period reported that she seemed sharper, more determined, and if possible, more fearless than before. She was awarded the Iron Cross First Class in recognition of her continued test flying work and her recovery. Hitler presented her with this decoration personally as well, making her one of the very few women in German history to have received both grades of the Iron Cross. The middle years of the war saw Hanna involved in a range of projects that illustrate the particular nature of her contribution to the German war effort. She was not involved in the administration of the regime, in the implementation of racial policies, or in the running of the concentration camp system. She had nothing to do with any of that. Her world was the cockpit and the airstrip, the wind tunnel and the research institute. And yet the projects she worked on were deeply embedded in the Nazi war machine. One of the most controversial was her involvement in the development of the Fiesler FY-103R, a piloted version of the V-1 flying bomb, which became known as the Reichenberg program. This was, in essence, a suicide weapon. The idea was that a German pilot would guide the flying bomb to its target and then eject at the last moment, theoretically giving them a chance of survival. In practice, ejection at the speeds and altitudes involved was essentially impossible, and everyone who worked on the project understood that. The Reichenberg program placed Hanna Reitsch at the moral center of one of the war's most troubling questions. She tested the manned version of the FY-103R herself, flying it to gather data on its aerodynamic characteristics and to assess whether it was even theoretically survivable. She was, by her own account and by the account of colleagues, not a passionate advocate for suicide missions. She was a test pilot doing a job. But she did the job. And the job involved evaluating a weapon whose intended use was the death of its own operator. This is not the profile of a woman who kept herself at a comfortable distance from the machinery of war. Whatever her motivations, her actual conduct placed her squarely within the most extreme dimensions of the German war effort. She also became deeply involved with Otto Skorzeny, the flamboyant SS commando officer who had carried out the dramatic rescue of Mussolini in September 1943. Skorzeny was working on plans for a series of special operations that required unconventional aircraft and unconventional pilots, and Hanna Reitsch was his natural collaborator. They discussed the use of gliders for covert infiltration operations, the possibility of landing agents behind enemy lines, and various other schemes that sat at the edges of conventional warfare. The relationship was professional, though some accounts suggest a mutual admiration that went beyond the purely operational. Skorzeny was himself a figure of extraordinary personal courage, and he recognized the same quality in Hanna Reitsch. They were, in many respects, kindred spirits. As 1943 turned to 1944, the war's trajectory had become unmistakable. Stalingrad had broken the back of the German advance in the east. The Allies had landed in Sicily and were pushing up through Italy. The bombing campaign against Germany itself was intensifying. The industrial infrastructure of the Reich was being systematically dismantled from the air, and yet Hanna Reitsch flew on. She was now working on the development of new aircraft types intended to restore German air superiority, including early versions of jet-powered designs that represented the cutting edge of aeronautical technology. She flew the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, in its early test phase. She flew variants of the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger. She was, in the final year of the war, probably the most experienced test pilot in Germany, male or female, accumulating flying time on more aircraft types than almost anyone else in the world. But it is not her technical achievements that make the final chapter of Hanna Reitsch's war story so extraordinary. It is what she chose to do when the end came. When Berlin was encircled by Soviet forces in April 1945 and the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery had become the last redoubt of Adolf Hitler and the remaining Nazi leadership, Hanna Reitsch flew in. Let that sink in for a moment. The city was burning. Soviet artillery was pounding it into rubble from multiple directions. The Tempelhof airfield was no longer usable. The only available landing strip was a narrow stretch of the east-west axis, the grand ceremonial boulevard that bisected the centre of Berlin, cleared of rubble by desperate labour and marked with improvised lights. And Hanna Reitsch, with General Robert Ritter von Greim as her passenger, flew a Fiesler Storch into that burning city. The flight on April 26, 1945 was not Hanna Reitsch's first attempt to reach Berlin. She and von Greim had actually attempted the approach in a larger aircraft, but Soviet ground fire had disabled it and wounded von Greim in the foot. Hanna had taken control of the aircraft from the wounded general and managed to land it safely. Then she commandeered a Fiesler Storch from a Luftwaffe unit in the suburb of Gatow and flew the final leg herself, threading between burning buildings and under the fire of Soviet anti-aircraft guns to land on the east-west axis in the heart of the besieged city. The purpose of this extraordinary flight was to bring von Greim to Hitler, who wanted to appoint him as the new commander of the Luftwaffe in place of Hermann Göring, whom Hitler had stripped of all titles and ordered arrested after Göring had presumed to assume leadership in the final days. Von Greim received his field marshal's baton from Hitler himself in the bunker below. Hanna Reitsch spent 3 days in the Führerbunker during the final apocalyptic phase of the battle for Berlin. She was present during what may have been the most extraordinary 3 days in the entire history of the Third Reich. Around her, the senior figures of a regime that had brought catastrophic destruction to an entire continent were making their final dispositions. Some were already dead. Goebbels and his wife Magda were preparing to kill themselves and their 6 children, which they would do on May 1st. Heinrich Himmler had already been dismissed in disgrace after secretly attempting to open negotiations with the Western Allies. Martin Bormann was still present, scurrying through the corridors of the bunker with the notebook of a man who still believed power could be accumulated even now. And through it all, Hitler himself moved in a deteriorating state, his hands shaking, his face grey, his mind fixed on a fantasy of rescue that had no basis in reality. What did Hanna Reitsch make of what she saw? This is perhaps the most fascinating question about her entire story. She was, by this point, witnessing the final implosion of the regime she had served, the complete moral and physical collapse of the world she had given her life to. And her reaction was not, apparently, one of political disillusionment, but of something closer to grief and outrage that the people around Hitler were failing him, that they were not meeting the standard that the moment demanded. She was appalled by what she perceived as the cowardice of those who were trying to flee or negotiate. She was not appalled, at least not at this point, by the man at the centre of the catastrophe. Her loyalty to him appears to have survived even this, though what she thought in the years that followed is a more complicated question. She asked Hitler for permission to remain in Berlin and to die there. He refused. He told her that her flying, her example, what she represented for German aviation and German womanhood, was too important to be wasted. He wanted her to leave with von Greim, to carry messages to whoever remained of the functional Nazi leadership outside the city. On the night of April 28th to 29th, 1945, Hanna Reitsch and von Greim took off from the east-west axis in a small training aircraft, a Arado R-96, threading their way through the burning city under fire and eventually reaching safety. It was the last aircraft to leave besieged Berlin. Hanna Reitsch was the last person to escape that city who was not doing so as a fugitive or a prisoner of war. She had flown into the burning heart of Nazi Germany's final agony and flown out again. There is no one else in the entire story of the Third Reich of whom that can be said. The Germany she returned to was already ceasing to exist. Hitler killed himself on April 30th, 1945. Goebbels and Magda murdered their children and then themselves on May 1st. Karl Dönitz, commanding from Plön, accepted the reality of unconditional surrender. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hanna Reitsch was in Austria when the end came. She was captured by American forces at Kitzbühel in the Tyrol on May 9, 1945, just a single day after the formal surrender. She was not in hiding. She had made no effort to escape or to conceal herself. This fact alone distinguishes her from a significant proportion of the senior figures of the Nazi regime, men and women who spent months or years evading Allied justice. Hanna Reitsch was held by American military intelligence and subjected to extensive interrogation. The sessions that followed were among the most revealing interrogations conducted by the Allies in the entire post-war period. The American intelligence officer who led the initial interrogations was Robert Work, and his report, which ran to dozens of pages, became an important historical document. Hanna was cooperative, detailed, and in many respects surprisingly forthcoming about what she had witnessed in the bunker during those final days. She gave a vivid and first-hand account of the people she had seen there, the conversations that had taken place, the atmosphere of unreality and collapse that had pervaded the final days of the Reich. She described the Goebbels family in the bunker. She described Hitler's condition. She described Bormann. She gave the American interrogators material that no one else could have provided because no one else who had been in the bunker had survived and been captured so quickly. Her interrogations were not, however, free of self-serving elements. Hanna Reitsch consistently presented herself as a person of good faith who had served Germany rather than Nazism, a patriot rather than an ideologue, someone who had been deceived about the full nature of the regime she served. She denied knowledge of the extermination camps and the Holocaust, a denial that has been the subject of debate among historians ever since. She admitted that she had known the war was lost long before many in the Nazi leadership had acknowledged it, and she expressed what appeared to be genuine anguish about the destruction of Germany. But she did not, even in these early interrogations, offer the kind of comprehensive moral reckoning that might have been expected from someone with as clear a view of the regime's final days as she had possessed. She was held in American captivity for 18 months, until late 1946. This was a relatively short period compared to many of her contemporaries, and it reflected a judgment by American authorities that she was not a war criminal in any actionable legal sense. She had not given orders to kill anyone. She had not administered any aspect of the regime's system of terror. She was a test pilot who had flown for the German military, and the evidence that she had personally committed crimes was not sufficient to justify prosecution. She was released without charge. This was the correct legal judgment, but it satisfied almost no one. Those who believed she was morally complicit in the Nazi regime felt that she had escaped accountability. Those who admired her flying achievements were offended by the suggestion that she needed to be prosecuted at all. Hanna Reitsch would spend the rest of her life navigating this deeply uncomfortable space between these two judgments. The Germany to which Hanna Reitsch returned after her release in 1946 was a country in the most profound possible state of rupture. The physical destruction was staggering. Cities that had stood for centuries lay in rubble. The economy was obliterated. The social fabric had been shredded by 12 years of totalitarianism, followed by total military defeat. And Germany was now occupied, divided, and subject to the judgment and governance of 4 foreign powers, each with its own vision of what post-Nazi Germany should become. Into this world, Hanna Reitsch emerged from American captivity without her freedom compromised, without criminal charges, but also without her career, without her aircraft, and without the country she had known. For a woman who had defined herself entirely through flying, the years immediately following her release were a kind of purgatory. Germany was forbidden from operating military aircraft, and civilian aviation was severely restricted in the immediate post-war period. Hanna had no aircraft to fly and no official organization through which to fly them. She was also a politically controversial figure. Her association with the Nazi regime, her presence in the bunker, her receipt of the Iron Cross from Hitler himself, all of these things made her a target of suspicion and, in some quarters, outright hostility. She was not a beloved figure in post-war Germany. Many Germans who were trying to rebuild their lives and re-establish a moral relationship with the rest of the world found her presence uncomfortable. She was too associated with everything they were trying to distance themselves from. And yet, Hanna Reitsch did not retreat into silence or obscurity. She wrote her memoir, published in German in 1951 under the title Fliegen mein Leben, which translates as Flying is My Life. The book was a remarkable document, vivid and technically accomplished in its descriptions of her flying career, less satisfying in its treatment of the political context within which that career had unfolded. Hanna was honest about having served the German military and about having admired Hitler. She was less honest, or less willing to be honest, about what she had understood of the regime's crimes, about what she might have done differently, and about the moral implications of her service. The book was a success in Germany and was translated into English, reaching an international audience. It confirmed her reputation as a genuinely extraordinary pilot, and it revived the debate about what exactly she had known and what she had chosen not to know. The question of what Hanna Reitsch knew and when she knew it is one of the most important questions that can be asked about her, and also one of the most difficult to answer definitively. In the immediate post-war period, she maintained that she had been unaware of the extermination camps and the full scope of the Holocaust. This position was not implausible for an ordinary German civilian living outside the major administrative centres. But Hanna Reitsch was not an ordinary German civilian. She moved in the highest circles of the Nazi regime. She met Hitler repeatedly. She was a familiar figure at Luftwaffe headquarters. She knew Göring, Himmler, and other senior figures of the regime. She was present in the Führer bunker in April 1945, where the full catastrophe of what the regime had done was, at least in outline, known to everyone. The claim that she was entirely ignorant of the Holocaust has been questioned by serious historians, most notably by the author Judy Battalion and others who have written about women in the Nazi regime. What can be said with some confidence is this. Hanna Reitsch was not involved in the planning or execution of the Holocaust. She did not give orders that resulted in deaths other than as an inevitable consequence of military aviation in wartime, where the aircraft she tested were used to kill people. She was, in the moral taxonomy of the regime, a facilitator and a symbol rather than an executioner. But the distinction between those categories, however real in legal terms, does not fully resolve the moral question. The regime she served killed 6 million Jews and millions of others. She served it enthusiastically, publicly, and with distinction. Her famous face and her famous achievements were used as propaganda, as evidence of what Nazi Germany could produce. Whatever she knew or did not know about the camps, she gave the regime the gift of her talent and her image, and the regime used that gift. The 1950s brought a slow reintegration into a world that was cautiously reopening to aviation. West Germany began to rebuild its civil aviation infrastructure, and restrictions on German civilian flying were progressively relaxed. Hanna Reitsch began to fly again. For her, this was not merely a professional resumption, but a profound personal restoration. Flying was where she was herself, where the complicated questions of politics and complicity and historical judgment fell away, and there was only the aircraft and the air and the sky. She threw herself back into it with the same intensity she had always brought. She became involved in the West German gliding community, which was in the process of rebuilding its infrastructure and re-establishing Germany's international reputation in the sport. Gliding had been her first love, and it remained a central part of her flying life. She also began to travel internationally as a representative of German aviation, something that would have been inconceivable in the immediate post-war years but became possible as the Cold War redrew the geopolitical map and West Germany was rehabilitated as a key Western ally. She went to the United States, where she was received with considerable interest by the aviation community. She went to India, where Prime Minister Nehru received her and where she set up a gliding school. She went to Africa. Africa in particular became a significant part of Hanna Reitsch's later story. She had a complex and not entirely uncomplicated relationship with the newly independent African nations of the late 1950s and 1960s. On one hand, she brought genuine expertise and a passionate commitment to spreading aviation as a technology of national development and personal freedom. On the other hand, her record of service to the Nazi regime was not unknown, and her willingness to work with certain governments raised questions about the ideological company she was prepared to keep. In 1959, she went to Ghana, which had gained independence under Kwame Nkrumah in 1957, and she established a national flying school at Accra. The Ghana Air Sports Centre, as it became known, was one of the genuine achievements of her post-war career, a practical contribution to the development of a young nation that had nothing to do with the Third Reich. Her relationship with Kwame Nkrumah was warm and professionally productive. Nkrumah was fascinated by aviation and saw it as a symbol of Ghana's modernity and independence. Hanna shared his enthusiasm and worked hard to build the school into a real institution. She trained pilots, developed curriculum, and imported her German precision and discipline into a context that was entirely different from anything she had previously experienced. She was, by all accounts, a genuinely effective educator, patient and demanding in equal measure, someone who pushed her students hard because she believed passionately that flying required the highest possible standards and that those standards were achievable by anyone willing to work for them. She stayed in Ghana for several years, and the program she built outlasted her time there. She also worked in other African contexts, most controversially in Biafra during the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970. The Biafran conflict was a humanitarian catastrophe of enormous proportions, with estimates of between 1 and 3 million dead, many of them civilian victims of famine caused by the Nigerian government's blockade of the secessionist eastern region. Hanna Reitsch flew supplies into Biafra during the conflict, an act of humanitarian aviation that attracted both admiration and controversy. She was piloting aircraft through dangerous conditions, delivering aid to a starving population. But her presence in Biafra also had a political dimension. She was associated with the Biafran cause, and the Biafran government used her presence for its own propaganda purposes, just as the Nazi government had once done. The pattern of her being deployed as a symbol was repeating itself. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, Hanna Reitsch remained one of the most prominent figures in international aviation circles. She continued to set records, including soaring records in the United States, that demonstrated her continued excellence at the competitive gliding that had been her first passion. She was a frequent figure at aviation conferences and air shows, always sought out by the press, always generating the mixture of admiration for her flying and discomfort about her past that had defined her public image since 1945. She gave countless interviews, and in these interviews she was consistent in her positions. She acknowledged that she had served the Nazi regime. She expressed grief and shame about the destruction that the regime had caused. She did not, however, subject herself to the kind of sustained public moral accounting that some critics believed was required. The contrast with her fellow test pilot Melita von Stauffenberg is instructive and has been made often. Melita was in many ways Hanna's closest equivalent in the German wartime aviation world. She was also a highly decorated test pilot, also a recipient of the Iron Cross, also someone who had contributed significantly to the German military effort. But Melita was of partly Jewish ancestry, something she had concealed or managed through various bureaucratic mechanisms. Her brother-in-law Klaus von Stauffenberg was the officer who placed the bomb in the Wolf's Lair in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler. Melita had knowledge of the resistance plot and may have been marginally involved in its planning. She was arrested by the Gestapo after the plot failed, interrogated and eventually released, though kept under surveillance. She died in April 1945 when her aircraft was shot down by an American fighter. Melita's story has been increasingly celebrated in recent years as an example of what principled resistance under impossible conditions could look like. Hanna's story offers no such redemption narrative. She flew for the regime, not against it. She went to the bunker, not to the resistance. The comparison, while fair in its broad outlines, is also somewhat reductive. The moral universe of wartime Germany was not simply divided between resistors and collaborators, with everyone knowing exactly what the right choice was and choosing accordingly. Most people who served in Nazi Germany's institutions did so in a context of extreme social pressure, genuine patriotism, incomplete information, and the very human tendency to focus on the immediate practical world rather than the larger systemic evil. Hanna Reitsch was a test pilot. She flew aircraft. She did not run concentration camps. The gap between her moral culpability and that of the people who actually designed and implemented the Holocaust is enormous. And yet she was not morally neutral. She served a criminal regime with distinction, accepted its highest honours, and flew into its final stronghold out of what appears to have been something like loyalty. These things matter. One of the most interesting dimensions of Hanna Reitsch's post-war life is her relationship with the question of her own fame and legacy. She was deeply aware of how she was perceived, both by those who admired her and by those who were hostile to her. She was particularly sensitive to what she saw as unfair characterizations, suggestions that she had been a Nazi ideologue of the First Order, a female Goebbels, a propagandist who had knowingly served evil. She pushed back against these characterizations, sometimes effectively and sometimes not. She pointed to her humanitarian work in Africa, to her role in developing aviation in the developing world, to her continued service to the cause of sport aviation as evidence that her life had been about more than service to the Third Reich. She was not wrong about any of this, but the insistence with which she made these arguments sometimes worked against her, making her seem more concerned with her own reputation than with the genuine moral reckoning her story demanded. She was also, in this period, dealing with the consequences of her physical injuries. The head trauma she had sustained in the Me-163 crash of 1942 had never fully resolved, and she experienced periodic health difficulties related to it in the post-war years. She also sustained other injuries in the various accidents and incidents that are almost inevitable over a very long flying career. By the 1960s, she was in her 50s and had been flying for more than 3 decades, accumulating the wear and damage that goes with a career at the extreme edge of aviation. And yet, she kept flying. This, more than anything else, is the constant in her story. Whatever the political climate, whatever the historical judgment, whatever the state of her health or her reputation, Hanna Reitsch flew. In 1976, she returned to the United States for a significant occasion. She attended the ceremonies marking the bicentennial of American independence, an invitation that reflected the rehabilitation of her international standing as an aviator. She was celebrated there not as a relic of Nazi Germany, but as one of the world's great pilots, a living connection to the heroic age of early aviation. This occasion prompted a fresh round of media coverage, and Hanna was once again in the position she had occupied for 4 decades, navigating the impossible tension between admiration for her flying and discomfort with her past. She handled it, as she always did, with a combination of genuine dignity and a certain strategic selectiveness about what she was willing to acknowledge. Let us pause here and consider what Hanna Reitsch represents in the wider story of women in Nazi Germany. The women we typically associate with the Third Reich fall into several fairly distinct categories. There are the wives of Nazi leaders, women like Eva Braun, Magda Goebbels, and Ilse Hess, whose proximity to power was purely a function of their relationships with powerful men, and whose culpability ranges from passive complicity to, in Magda Goebbels' case, direct murder of her own children. There are the female concentration camp guards, the Aufseherinnen of places like Ravensbrück and Auschwitz-Birkenau, women like Irma Gräser and Hermine Braunsteiner, who participated directly in the violence of the extermination system and whose crimes were of a kind that defies easy comprehension. There are the ordinary women of Nazi Germany, the millions of German wives and mothers and daughters who went about their lives within the framework of the Nazi state, some enthusiastically supportive, some indifferent, some quietly resistant. None of these categories fit Hanna Reitsch. She was not defined by her relationship with a man. She never married and never had children. Her identity was entirely self-constructed around her own achievement and her own passion. She was not a perpetrator of direct violence. She was not passive or domestic. She was in a regime that insisted on reducing women to wives, mothers, and custodians of racial purity, something the regime's own ideology had no conceptual space for. An independent woman of extraordinary professional achievement who operated entirely outside the domestic sphere the Nazis had tried to reserve for women. There is a deep irony here. The Nazi regime celebrated Hanna Reitsch precisely because she was useful to them as a symbol of German excellence and technological superiority. But in celebrating her, they were celebrating exactly the kind of female autonomy and professional independence that Nazi ideology officially opposed. This paradox sits at the heart of her story. The Nazis needed Hanna Reitsch because she embodied something they could not otherwise produce, a female figure who could serve as a propaganda asset in the aeronautical domain without requiring the regime to rethink its fundamental positions about gender. They solved this problem by treating her as a kind of exception, an honorary man in the aviation world, someone whose achievements were celebrated without drawing any general conclusions about what women could or should be permitted to do. And Hanna, for her part, does not appear to have reflected deeply on this paradox. She was not a feminist in any meaningful sense. She did not see herself as a trailblazer for female autonomy. She was simply doing what she loved and could not imagine doing anything else. The women who became concentration camp guards, by contrast, had chosen to participate in the machinery of killing in the most direct possible way. Irma Graeser, the so-called beautiful beast of Belsen, joined the SS Helferinnen at the age of 19 and served at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen. She was found guilty of war crimes at the Belsen trial in 1945, executed by hanging on December 13, 1945, at the age of 22. Her crimes included the arbitrary shooting of prisoners, the setting of dogs on inmates, and participation in selections for the gas chambers. Whatever her motivation, whatever mixture of ideology and sadism and peer pressure and institutional culture drove her actions, she was a killer. Hermine Braunsteiner was an Austrian woman who served as a guard at Ravensbrück and then at the Majdanek extermination camp in occupied Poland, where she was known as the Mar for her habit of stamping on prisoners. She escaped to Canada after the war, married an American, and lived quietly in Queens, New York until the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal identified her in 1964. She was eventually extradited to West Germany in 1973, the first person ever extradited from the United States for Nazi war crimes. She was convicted in 1981 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Between Hanna Reitsch and women like Graeser and Braunsteiner lies the entire moral landscape of female experience in the Third Reich. Hanna never killed anyone directly. The aircraft she tested were used to kill people, and the regime she served killed millions. But the chain of moral causation that connects her to those deaths is long and mediated by many other agents and decisions. The chain that connected the female camp guards to the deaths they caused was direct and immediate. This distinction matters legally. It also matters morally, even if it doesn't resolve the question of complicity altogether. The wives of Nazi leaders occupy yet another moral category, and they make a revealing contrast to Hanna Reitsch. Eva Braun is perhaps the most famous and in many ways the most puzzling of these women. She was Hitler's long-term companion and, in the final hours of his life, his wife. She was with him in the Führer bunker when Hanna Reitsch was there, though there is no record of any significant interaction between the two women. Eva Braun was, by almost every account, a woman of limited political engagement, someone who loved Hitler as a person without involving herself deeply in the political and ideological dimensions of his rule. She was not involved in policy. She was not a significant figure in the Nazi hierarchy. She was Hitler's private companion, photographed extensively in domestic settings, shown as the embodiment of German feminine beauty and domesticity. She died beside Hitler on April 30, 1945, by taking cyanide, having finally, in the last hours, received the public acknowledgement of their relationship that she had sought for years. Magda Goebbels is a more complex and in some ways more disturbing figure. She was deeply committed to the Nazi ideology, far more so than her husband in some respects, which is a remarkable statement given that Joseph Goebbels was the architect of Nazi propaganda. She had met Hitler in 1930 and developed what appears to have been a powerful personal attachment to him. An attachment so strong that some historians have described it as a kind of political passion, almost religious in its intensity. She married Goebbels in 1931, with Hitler serving as witness. And the marriage, though troubled and marked by Goebbels' chronic infidelities, lasted until the end. In the bunker in May 1945, Magda Goebbels made a decision that is almost impossible to comprehend from a moral standpoint. She gave her 6 children, whose names all began with the letter H as a tribute to Hitler, lethal injections of morphine, and then, when they were unconscious, crushed cyanide capsules into their mouths. Helmut, Helga, Hildegard, Holdein, Hedwig, and Haida, aged between 4 and 12, all died. Magda then took cyanide herself and died beside her husband. She had told her children that the world that was coming would not be worth living in. It was perhaps the single most monstrous act carried out by any individual in the Führer bunker in those final days. Hanna Reitsch was aware of what was happening to the Goebbels children. She was in the bunker during the period when their deaths were being planned. The accounts she gave in her post-war interrogations and in her memoir describe the atmosphere of the bunker in those days, but do not engage directly with what she thought about the fate of the children or whether she attempted to intervene. There is no evidence that she attempted any intervention. Whether this was because she genuinely believed, as Magda Goebbels apparently did, that death was preferable to life in a post-Nazi world, or whether she was simply paralysed by the circumstances and her own conflicted loyalties, is something we cannot know with certainty. But the silence is noted. The contrast with Hanna's own conduct in the bunker is suggestive. She was not passive or fatalistic. She asked Hitler for permission to die in Berlin. She offered her services. She flew out carrying messages. She was, in her own account, appalled by the weakness and disorder around her. She was, in short, a person of agency and action, not of passive acquiescence. And yet, in the face of the most monstrous act in the bunker's history, the killing of 6 children, there is no record of that agency being deployed. Perhaps she did not know in advance. Perhaps she was as shocked as anyone. Perhaps the circumstances gave her no opening for intervention. We do not know. But it is a significant silence in the record. The women of the Nazi regime who are in many ways most directly comparable to Hanna Reitsch in terms of their professional engagement with the machinery of the state rather than their domestic proximity to it are the female administrators and functionaries who worked within the system without carrying out direct violence. Women like Gertrude Scholz-Klink, who led the NS Frauenschaft, the Nazi women's organization, and wielded very real administrative power within the regime's gender structures. Scholz-Klink was a true believer who ran a mass organization with millions of members and exercised significant influence over the social programming of German women during the Nazi period. After the war, she lived under a false identity in Württemberg for 3 years before being discovered, tried by a French military court in 1948 and sentenced to 18 months in prison. She subsequently lived in West Germany and remained an unrepentant Nazi until her death in 1999 at the age of 97. The comparison with Scholz-Klink highlights something important about Hanna Reitsch's position. Scholz-Klink had ideological power and administrative responsibility for shaping the lives of millions of German women. She used that power in service of the Nazi racial and gender ideology. Hanna Reitsch had no such power. She had a cockpit and a very specific set of technical skills. She did not shape ideology. She did not run organizations. She did not make policy. Her contribution to the regime was symbolic and technical, not administrative. This distinction does not exonerate her, but it does locate her differently in the moral geography of the Third Reich. The 1970s brought Hanna Reitsch to the final chapter of her remarkable life. She was now in her 60s, still flying, still giving interviews, still navigating the paradox of her legacy. She had returned to live in Germany after her years in Africa and her various international engagements. She had become, in a strange way, a figure of the past and of the present simultaneously. A connection to the heroic and terrible world of early aviation, a survivor of experiences that no one else alive had shared, and at the same time, a still active participant in the aviation community that was her truest home. In 1979, Hanna Reitsch attended the famous air meet at Erlinghausen in North Rhine-Westphalia, one of Germany's premier gliding events. She was still considered one of the world's great glider pilots, and her presence at the event was a significant attraction. She flew that day with the precision and elegance that had characterized her flying for 50 years. She was 67 years old, she had spent more than half a century in the air, and she was still recognizably the same pilot who had circled in thermals above the Riesengebirge as a teenager, the same person who had flown into burning Berlin, the same woman who had tested aircraft that no one else would touch. Shortly after this event, Hanna Reitsch suffered a heart attack. She died on August 24, 1979 in Frankfurt am Main, at the age of 67. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. She was buried in Salzburg, Austria, the city she had come to consider her home. Her grave became, in the years that followed, a site of some controversy. It attracted visitors of different kinds, aviation enthusiasts who came to pay tribute to one of the greatest pilots of the 20th century, and others whose motivations were less wholesome, people who associated her primarily with the Nazi regime, and who came for reasons that had nothing to do with aviation. The duality of her legacy in death as in life. What is her legacy, finally? How should we think about Hanna Reitsch? This is a question that historians and aviation enthusiasts and students of the Third Reich have been arguing about since 1945. And there is no simple answer. She was unquestionably one of the most gifted pilots who ever lived. In the context of her time, she achieved things that were technically extraordinary by any standard, and that many people, including many of the world's best aviators, considered impossible. She flew in conditions and on aircraft types that killed experienced men. She survived catastrophic injuries and returned to the cockpit. She flew into burning Berlin, when anyone with a functioning instinct for self-preservation would have turned back. These things are real and they are remarkable. She was also a servant of the Nazi regime who accepted its highest honours, appeared willingly in its propaganda, and maintained a personal relationship with Adolf Hitler. She flew into the Führer bunker not to deliver a bomb but to deliver a field marshal's commission, and she emerged carrying messages from a man who had authored one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. These things are also real. They cannot be wished away by pointing to her flying achievements, any more than her flying achievements can be cancelled by pointing to her service to the regime. Both things exist. Both must be held. The particular quality that makes Hanna Reitsch unlike every other woman in the Nazi story is this. She was not defined by her relationship to a man, not by ideology alone, not by domestic complicity, not by direct violence. She was defined by a skill and a passion that transcended the political context, and yet that skill and that passion placed her in the very eye of the political storm. She was a free agent in a regime that denied freedom to millions, and she used that freedom to serve the regime rather than to resist it. The tragedy of her story, if it is a tragedy, is precisely that the extraordinary independence of spirit that made her a great pilot was not extended to a questioning of the world in which she exercised it. To fully appreciate what Hanna Reitsch represented, it is necessary to understand just how thoroughly the Nazi regime's official ideology sought to constrain and define women. The doctrine of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church was not merely a slogan. It was a governing principle of social organization that shaped policy across every dimension of German life. Women were expected to embrace their biological destiny, to marry early, to bear many children, to create the domestic conditions within which German men could focus on the world historical work of building the Reich. Careers, ambition, professional achievement, these were male prerogatives. A woman who sought to make herself in the world through her own efforts rather than through her relationships and her reproduction was, in the Nazi ideological framework, a deviant, a product of the corrupting influence of liberalism and Jewish modernity. And yet the regime celebrated Hanna Reitsch. It gave her the Iron Cross, the military's highest decoration. It featured her in newsreels and newspapers. It sent her to international aviation events as one of Germany's most prominent representatives. It held her up as an example of what Germany could produce. How did this square with the ideology? The answer, as we have noted, was through the mechanism of the exception, by treating Hanna as a special case, a prodigy whose gifts placed her outside the normal categories. But there is something more interesting happening here, something that the regime itself may not have fully appreciated. In celebrating Hanna Reitsch, the Nazi propaganda machine was inadvertently demonstrating the falseness of its own gender ideology. It was showing to anyone willing to look that women were capable of exactly the kind of achievement the ideology reserved for men, that the barriers were social and legal rather than natural and biological. The propaganda backfired at the level of logic, even as it succeeded at the level of image. Hanna Reitsch was not the only woman to occupy this paradoxical position within the Nazi regime. The film director Leni Riefenstahl is the other most prominent example. Riefenstahl was also a woman of extraordinary professional achievement operating within and for the Nazi regime, also someone who claimed after the war that her involvement had been purely artistic rather than ideological, also someone who maintained a personal relationship with Hitler. The comparison between Riefenstahl and Reitsch is instructive. Both were artists in a sense, though their medium was different. Riefenstahl made films and Reitsch flew aircraft, but both were engaged in the creation of images and experiences that served the regime's self-presentation. Both claimed after the war that they had not fully understood what they were serving. Both were extensively interrogated by Allied authorities. Both escaped criminal prosecution. Both spent the rest of their long lives navigating the difficult space between artistic legacy and historical judgment. The differences between them are also instructive. Riefenstahl's films were explicitly propagandistic in intention and effect. Triumph of the Will and Olympia were not merely artistic works that happened to be made in Nazi Germany. They were tools of Nazi self-promotion, designed to project an image of power, beauty, and racial superiority. Riefenstahl collaborated with the regime at the level of meaning, not just at the level of service. Hanna Reitsch's contribution was more purely technical. She flew aircraft. The propaganda value of her flying was real, but it was derivative, a consequence of her technical achievement rather than its purpose. She was not designing propaganda. She was flying aircraft, and the propaganda machinery harvested the images. This distinction is not trivial, though it is not exculpatory either. What both women share, and what distinguishes them sharply from the female Nazi archetypes, is a complete indifference to the domestic role the regime prescribed for women. Neither married, neither had children in the conventional sense, though Riefenstahl had a son late in life. Neither defined herself through a man. Both built careers entirely on their own terms, careers that required an absolute focus and dedication that left no room for the feminine domestic ideal the regime promoted. Both, in this sense, were living refutations of what they were supposed to represent. The Nazi regime needed them and used them, and simultaneously could not fully accommodate them within its own ideological framework. Now, let us examine more closely the specific technical achievements of Hanna Reitsch's flying career, because they deserve more detailed attention than a simple catalogue of records and firsts can provide. The world of 1930s experimental aviation was genuinely on the frontier of human knowledge. The physics of flight at extreme speeds and altitudes was poorly understood. Aircraft were built with a combination of engineering theory and practical experiment that relied heavily on test pilots to close the gap between what was designed and what actually happened in the air. The test pilots of that era were, in a very real sense, doing science with their bodies. Each flight was an experiment. Each crash was a data point. The Fokker-Achilles FW-61 helicopter, which Hanna flew in the indoor demonstration of 1938, was a machine of almost comical complexity by modern standards. It had 2 rotors mounted on outrigger booms, each spinning in opposite directions to cancel the torque that would otherwise send the aircraft into an uncontrolled spin. The controls were deeply counterintuitive, requiring the pilot to make simultaneous inputs in multiple axes, each affecting the others in ways that were not always predictable. Modern helicopter pilots train for many months before their aircraft can be considered safe, and they do so in aircraft with control systems that have been refined over decades of development. Hanna flew the FW-61 in its early developmental phase, when many of the control characteristics were still being worked out. She flew it in an indoor arena, where any error would have resulted in collision with the structure. She flew it before thousands of spectators, and did so with apparent ease. The technical difficulty of what she was doing was not apparent to the audience, and that invisibility is itself a measure of her mastery. The Messerschmitt. Me-163 Comet, in which she was so severely injured, was a machine of entirely different character. Where the helicopter demanded patience and precision, the Comet demanded the ability to process information at almost inhuman speed. It climbed at rates of more than 3,000 meters per minute, a figure that was literally unprecedented in the history of aviation at the time. A pilot who took off in the Comet reached operational altitude in minutes. The aircraft's powered endurance was only about 12 minutes, after which the pilot had to glide back to the airfield using what remained of his or her judgment and skill. The unpowered glide characteristics of the Me-163 were also tricky, because the aircraft had been optimized for powered performance and behaved quite differently without its engine. The landing, without conventional undercarriage in later versions but rather on a retractable skid, was notoriously dangerous and required exceptional judgment. That Hanna survived the crash of the Me-163 at all was partly luck, and partly the fact that she was a pilot of such exceptional skill that even as the aircraft disintegrated around her, she was making the right control inputs to minimize the impact. The fractured skull, Broken jaw and severe head trauma she sustained would have been even more severe in less skilled hands. That she recovered and returned to the same kind of flying, testing experimental aircraft at the limits of their performance, speaks to a psychological resilience that is almost as remarkable as her physical skill. Her work on the Feisler FY-103R Reichenberg is perhaps the most morally charged of her technical achievements, and it deserves examination in some detail because it has been widely misrepresented. The Reichenberg was a manned version of the V-1 flying bomb, developed in 1944 at the initiative of a group of Luftwaffe and Luftwaffe-adjacent figures who believed that Germany's increasingly desperate military situation required the use of suicide tactics. The proposal was championed by Hanna Reitsch herself, who brought it to Hitler's attention along with other advocates. The idea was that German pilots would fly the Reichenberg into Allied warships and other high-value targets, sacrificing themselves in the manner of the Japanese kamikaze pilots. Hitler was initially enthusiastic. He approved the project for development. Now, the characterization of Hanna Reitsch as the enthusiastic promoter of German suicide tactics is one that has been attached to her legacy and used to argue that she was uniquely fanatical. But the reality is more nuanced. The historical record suggests that Hanna's advocacy for the Reichenberg program was motivated less by a death wish or a fanatical commitment to the regime, and more by a characteristically pragmatic assessment of what the military situation required. Germany was losing. Conventional tactics were not working. Special measures were needed. The Reichenberg was one option. She was also aware that the program, as it was technically conceived, did not necessarily require the death of the pilot. The theoretical possibility of ejection before impact meant that it was not, in strict definition, a suicide program. Hanna tested the aircraft precisely to determine whether that theoretical survival possibility was real. The answer, as she discovered through her own flights, was that it was not. The Reichenberg as built did not offer a realistic chance of pilot survival. The ejection mechanism was inadequate. The speeds and altitudes involved made escape essentially impossible. To Hanna Reitsch's credit, she reported this honestly. She did not pretend that the program offered viable survival prospects. She flew the aircraft, gathered the data, and delivered an honest assessment. The program did. Not go forward on any significant operational scale, partly because the war ended before it could be fully implemented. The pilots who were trained for it, and there were about 70 who volunteered and underwent training, never flew operational missions. The volunteers for the Reichenberg program are themselves a significant datum in the history of the war. They were not coerced. They came forward voluntarily, motivated by a mixture of genuine conviction, despair, peer pressure, and the particular psychological atmosphere of a country in the final stages of a losing war. That atmosphere, in which normal calculations of self-interest and survival were distorted by years of propaganda, military defeat, and existential fear, is important context. It does not make the Reichenberg program anything other than what it was, the contemplation of suicide as a military tactic. But it does suggest that Hanna Reitsch, in supporting it, was not an isolated fanatic. She was, in this as in so much else, a product of her time and place. Let us also consider more carefully what happened to Hanna in the Führer bunker in those 3 days of April 1945, because the account she gave of that experience is one of the most vivid and revealing documents of the entire final phase of the war. She arrived in a city that was already in its death throes. The Soviet army had encircled Berlin completely. Artillery was firing from multiple directions simultaneously. Buildings were burning. The streets were littered with rubble and bodies. The civilian population was in a state of shock, having been subjected to weeks of increasingly intense bombardment after years of propaganda that had assured them of ultimate victory. Into this apocalyptic scene, Hanna Reitsch flew with the cool precision of someone for whom the concept of danger had been permanently recalibrated by decades of test flying. Her account of the people she found in the bunker has the quality of a dream recorded by someone of exceptional powers of observation. She described Hitler as physically diminished, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his face grey and somehow smaller than she remembered it. He was still issuing orders, still talking about relief forces that were not coming, and counterattacks that would not be launched. She described Eva Braun as calm and composed, apparently at peace with what was coming. She described Bormann as a dark presence in the corridors, still calculating, still scheming, though what he could possibly have been scheming for in those circumstances is not clear. She described the Goebbels family, the 6 children moving through the bunker with an innocence that was almost unbearable against the backdrop of what was being planned for them. She described the atmosphere as one of unreality mixed with a strange kind of peace, as if the very extremity of the situation had stripped away the tensions and ambitions and rivalries of ordinary life and replaced them with something more fundamental. People in the bunker knew they were going to die. Most of them had made that calculation already. The question was simply when and how. In that context, the normal human motivations of career and reputation and self-advancement had become irrelevant, and what remained was whatever was most essentially each person. What was most essentially Hanna Reitsch in those circumstances appears to have been a fierce, burning loyalty, a desire to be useful, and an inability to accept the reality of defeat, even when defeat was literally surrounding her on every side. She asked Hitler, as we have noted, for permission to stay and die with him. He refused. She asked General von Greim to intercede on her behalf. He also declined to support the request. Hitler's response to her request was, characteristically, to turn it into a question of service and duty. Her duty, he told her, was not to die in Berlin, but to live and to continue to embody what Germany could produce. This was the kind of thing Hitler said to people when he wanted them to do what he required. It is possible that he genuinely believed it. It is also possible that it was simply the most effective way to get Hanna Reitsch out of the bunker, which he needed to happen because he needed von Greim back in the air to take command of whatever remained of the Luftwaffe. Whatever his motivation, the result was that Hanna Reitsch flew out of Berlin alive. The messages she carried when she left were addressed to various figures in the remaining Nazi leadership, most of them already either dead, captured, or in the process of attempting to negotiate independently with the Allies. Himmler, to whom one of the messages was addressed, had already opened negotiations with Folke Bernadotte, the Swedish humanitarian who was acting as an intermediary. Hitler had learned of this and stripped Himmler of all his offices, declaring him a traitor. The messages Hanna carried were therefore addressed to a political reality that had already ceased to exist. They were the last communications of a regime that was, in every meaningful sense, already over. The flight out of Berlin on the night of April 28th to 29th, 1945 was Hanna Reitsch's last operational flight of the war, and it was as extraordinary as everything that had preceded it. The Arado R-96 they used was a training aircraft, not designed for combat conditions, with limited speed and no defensive armament. The city below was in flames. Soviet searchlights were sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft guns were firing at anything that moved. The east-west axis from which they took off was barely usable, littered with debris and illuminated only by improvised fires and vehicle headlights. That Hanna managed to take off at all, let alone to navigate the burning city and break through to relative safety, speaks to a level of flying skill that goes beyond what most pilots experience in an entire career. How does one even begin to quantify what it takes to fly through a burning city under fire in a training aircraft? The visual environment alone would have been almost impossible to navigate. Fire and smoke produced convection currents and sudden wind shifts. The smoke reduced visibility to near zero at some altitudes. Debris from bombed buildings was scattered across the airspace through which she was flying, and all of this was happening in darkness, illuminated only by fires. The cold, technical description of the flight does not capture what it must actually have felt like to be in that cockpit on that night. It must have been like flying through the end of the world, and Hanna Reitsch flew it. After her release from American captivity in 1946, as we have described, she began the long process of rebuilding her life. But there is a period between her release and the publication of her memoir in 1951 that deserves more attention than it typically receives. These were the years in which Hanna was, more than at any other time, confronted with the reality of what the regime she had served had done. The Nuremberg trials were in progress. The evidence of the extermination camps was being presented in exhaustive detail. The names and the numbers and the photographs were entering the historical record. Every German who was paying any attention at all knew by 1947 exactly what had happened. What did Hanna Reitsch think? Her public statements from this period are carefully calibrated. She expressed horror at the crimes that had been revealed. She expressed regret for her association with the regime. She emphasized her ignorance of the full extent of the atrocities during the war itself. But she did not engage in anything that could be described as a thorough public reckoning. She didn't write articles exploring the question of how someone in her position could have missed what was happening. She did not seek out survivors to apologize. She did not involve herself in the denazification process in any active way. She moved forward into her post-war life with the same determination and focus that had characterized her entire existence. The forward motion that had always been her greatest strength now served also as a way of not looking back. The years of the 1950s saw West Germany undertake the complicated project of what historians have called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the working through of the past. This was not a straightforward or uniformly sincere process. Many former Nazis were reintegrated into West German institutions with minimal scrutiny. The Adenauer government employed former members of the Nazi Foreign Service. Former SS officers served in the new Bundeswehr. Judges who had handed down death sentences under the Nazi legal system continued to sit on West German benches. The process of accountability was selective, often superficial, and frequently motivated more by the practical requirements of rebuilding a functioning state than by genuine moral reckoning. In this context, Hanna Reitsch's failure to engage in public self-examination was not unusual. It was, in many respects, entirely characteristic of the wider German response to the Nazi period. What was unusual about Hanna Reitsch was the nature of her visibility. Most former Nazis who were reintegrated into post-war German life did so quietly, drawing as little attention to themselves as possible, hoping that the passage of time would make the questions go away. Hanna could not do this even if she had wanted to. She was too famous, too distinctive, too much a part of the public record of the Nazi period to disappear into anonymity. Her face had been on posters. Her achievements had been reported in every German newspaper. She had received decorations from Hitler's own hand. She could not pretend to have been an obscure figure who had escaped the regime's notice, and so she adopted a different strategy. She remained visible. She acknowledged her service to the regime, and she argued with considerable force and some but not complete persuasiveness that her service had been to Germany and to aviation, rather than to Nazism as an ideology. Her re-engagement with international aviation in the 1950s and 1960s was, as we have noted, facilitated by the Cold War realignment that transformed West Germany from a defeated enemy into a key ally. The West German aviation industry was rebuilding. Lufthansa was re-established as a civilian carrier in 1953. The Bundeswehr, the new West German army, was founded in 1955 and began to develop its own air force. Hanna Reitsch was not part of the Bundeswehr, but the general rehabilitation of German aviation of which she was part proceeded against this backdrop. She competed in international soaring competitions in the late 1950s and acquitted herself with distinction, winning medals and setting records that demonstrated that her skills had not diminished significantly, even in the years when she had been largely grounded. She was now in her mid-40s, an age at which most competitive athletes have long since retired, but she flew with the same intensity and focus she had always brought. The international aviation community's attitude toward Hanna Reitsch in this period was characteristically ambivalent. Professional pilots and aviation enthusiasts were inclined to separate her flying achievements from her political associations, to judge her by the standards of the cockpit rather than the standards of the courtroom. People who knew nothing of history and cared little for politics encountered her at air meets and competitions and were simply struck by an extraordinary pilot, a small, precise, utterly focused woman who flew with a grace and authority that was immediately apparent to anyone who knew anything about flying. These encounters bypassed the historical complexity entirely and generated admiration that was uncomplicated by guilt or controversy. Others, particularly those with direct experience of Nazi persecution, could not and would not make that separation. For survivors of the Holocaust, for families whose members had been killed by the regime Hanna had served, the question of her flying achievements was simply irrelevant. What mattered was that she had accepted the Iron Cross from Hitler, that she had flown into the Führerbunker when the regime was in its death throes, that she had served enthusiastically and publicly a system of unprecedented criminality. That she had done so through a cockpit rather than through an administrative office or a killing field did not make the service less real. These two responses, admiration for the pilot and horror at the servant of the regime, would coexist in Hanna Reitsch's story until the end of her life and beyond. Her work in Ghana and other African countries in the late 1950s and early 1960s was, taken on its own terms, genuinely admirable. The Ghana Air Sports Centre that she built at Accra was a real institution that trained real pilots and contributed to the development of Ghanaian aviation. She did this work with dedication and professionalism. She brought to it the same meticulous standards she had always brought to everything connected with aviation. The pilots she trained were, by all accounts, well prepared and competent. She did not charge exorbitant fees. She did not use her position to enrich herself. She was simply a flying instructor who cared about the quality of her teaching and the progress of her students. But the context of that work is also relevant. Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah, was not a liberal democracy. Nkrumah was drifting steadily toward authoritarian one-party rule during the period of Hanna's association with his government. The Ghana Air Sports Centre was, among other things, a piece of Ghanaian state prestige, a way for Nkrumah to demonstrate that his new nation could attract international expertise and participate in the modern world. Hanna was useful to Nkrumah for some of the same reasons she had been useful to the Nazi regime. Her fame and her skills were a kind of reflected prestige. The fact that she had been decorated by Hitler was not necessarily a disqualification in Nkrumah's eyes. Many of the governments with which African nationalist leaders chose to associate in this period were ones that Western democracies would have found questionable. The politics of the Cold War and of African independence were not simple. The question of whether Hanna reflected adequately on the similarities between her situation in Nkrumah's Ghana and her situation in Hitler's Germany is one that her memoir and her published interviews do not answer definitively. She does not appear to have drawn the parallel explicitly. She presented her African work as a simple expression of her commitment to aviation and to the development of flying as a technology available to all people, regardless of nationality. This was not dishonest. It was simply incomplete in the way that her reflections on the Nazi period were also incomplete. She returned to Germany periodically throughout the 1960s and settled there more permanently in the 1970s. She continued to fly. She continued to give interviews. She became, in a curious way, a figure of the German post-war aviation revival, someone who embodied continuity between the pre-war gliding culture she had grown up in and the modern West German aviation community. The gliding community in particular had always been her most natural home, and it remained so. The values of soaring, the patient study of air masses, the exploitation of thermals and ridges and wave systems, the quest for distance and altitude through skill rather than power. These were values she had held since she was a teenager, and they were entirely detached from politics and history. In the soaring world, what mattered was whether you could read the sky and fly your glider to its limits. Hanna Reitsch could. She also remained a public figure in the sense of being willing to be interviewed and to speak about her experiences. She was not silent about the past. She discussed the war years, the bunker, Hitler, the regime, with journalists and historians who sought her out. She was more forthcoming than many of her contemporaries. The question of what she said and whether it was adequate is, as we have noted, a matter of debate. But she did not hide. She faced the questions, answered them in her own way, and lived publicly with the consequences. This is not a small thing. Many who served the Nazi regime with far less distinction and at far less personal risk spent their post-war years in careful concealment, revealing nothing, admitting nothing, hoping to die with their secrets intact. Hanna Reitsch did not do this. The final years of her life brought a kind of mellowing in some respects, if not in others. She remained physically active and continued to fly well into her 60s, though the extreme test flying of her wartime years was long behind her. She travelled, gave lectures, attended aviation events, maintained the network of professional and personal relationships she had built over 50 years in the air. She became, in the aviation world, something of an institution, a living link to the history of flight from its earliest days in the Weimar Republic through the extraordinary developments of the Second World War and into the modern era of jet aviation and beyond. Her physical appearance in these later years was striking. She was a small woman, not tall, with a compact, precise way of moving that suggested the disciplined economy of someone long accustomed to operating in confined cockpits. Her eyes were particularly remarkable, clear and direct, and focused in a way that people who met her invariably commented on. She spoke with precision and authority, choosing her words carefully, never verbose, always purposeful. She had the manner of someone who had spent a lifetime in environments where imprecision could kill you, and that manner carried over into every interaction. She was not an easy person, not warm in the conventional sense, but she was, by all accounts, genuinely impressive in the way that people who have done exceptional things and survived exceptional experiences tend to be. She died, as we have noted, on August 24, 1979, of a heart attack in Frankfurt am Main. She was 67 years old. The cause of death was unremarkable, the ordinary cardiac failure that claimed so many people at that age. There was nothing extraordinary about the manner of her dying, which was in the deepest possible contrast to the manner of her living. The woman who had flown rocket-powered aircraft, who had navigated burning Berlin under fire, who had sat across the table from Adolf Hitler in his final days, died of a heart attack in a hospital. It is somehow fitting that the end should have been so quiet. Her death prompted a wave of obituaries and assessments that encapsulated once again the impossible duality of her legacy. Aviation publications celebrated her as one of the great pilots of the 20th century, noting her records, her test flying achievements, her courage, and her longevity in a career that would have killed many lesser pilots many times over. Other publications focused on her service to the Nazi regime, her presence in the bunker, her receipt of the Iron Cross from Hitler. Some attempted to hold both things in view simultaneously, with varying degrees of success. None of them fully resolved the paradox that Hanna Reitsch had embodied for 34 years since the fall of the Third Reich, that extraordinary achievement and complicity with evil can coexist in a single human life, and that neither cancels the other out. The historical treatment of Hanna Reitsch in the decades since her death has evolved considerably. Early assessments tended to polarize around either celebration of her flying or condemnation of her Nazi associations. More recent scholarship has moved toward a more nuanced engagement with the complexity of her position, situating her within the broader context of women in the Third Reich and examining the specific ways in which her story challenges the categories through which we typically understand female complicity in Nazism. The American author Eileen Wellsome, in her work on the Nazi aviation program, and the British historian Claire Mully, in her biography of Melita von Stauffenberg, have both engaged with Hanna Reitsch in ways that treat her with appropriate complexity. Mully's comparison of Reitsch and Stauffenberg is particularly illuminating, because it shows two women of comparable skill and comparable position in the German aviation world, making different choices in the face of the same regime. Stauffenberg's choice to risk her life in association with the resistance is more admirable, but it was also facilitated by her specific circumstances, her family connection to the July 20th plot, her partly Jewish ancestry that gave her a personal stake in the regime's destruction, her ability to use her test flying role as cover for activities the regime would have treated as treasonable. Hannah's circumstances were different. She had no such personal connection to the resistance and no such personal stake in the regime's destruction. This does not make her service to the regime acceptable, but it does make it more comprehensible. The story of Hanna Reitsch cannot be fully understood without considering the stories of the other remarkable and deeply troubling women who orbited the Nazi world and whose trajectories offer different angles of comparison. We have already discussed the wives of Nazi leaders and the female concentration camp guards. Let us now turn to some of the other women whose stories illuminate different facets of what it meant to be a woman in the Third Reich. Magda Goebbels, whom we have already mentioned, is in many ways the figure who most powerfully defines the opposite end of the spectrum from Hanna Reitsch. Where Hanna was defined by independence, by professional achievement, by a life lived entirely on her own terms, Magda was defined by her relationship to powerful men and by an ideological commitment so total that it overrode even the most fundamental human instinct, the love of a mother for her children. Magda had not always been a committed Nazi. She had had a complicated earlier life, a childhood divided between Catholic and Jewish stepfathers, a first marriage that ended in divorce, a string of relationships that suggested a restless, searching quality in her personality. Her encounter with Hitler and with the Nazi movement was transformative in a way that can only be described as quasi-religious. She became, in the phrase of the historian Anja Klabunda, the First Lady of the Third Reich, not because she held any official position, but because she embodied the ideal of the Nazi woman, as Hitler apparently wanted it to be understood. She was beautiful, cultivated, aristocratic in bearing, and utterly committed. The tragedy of her 6 children, Helmut, Helga, Hildegard, Holdine, Hedwig, and Haida, is the darkest single act associated with any woman in the Nazi story, and it stands in the starkest possible contrast to Hanna Reitsch's history. Hanna had no children to protect or to kill. She had only herself to risk, and she risked herself constantly and voluntarily in the service of a passion she had chosen freely. Magda had 6 children who had no choice in anything, who loved their parents, and who died because their parents believed that the world that was coming was not worth living in. Whatever one thinks of Hanna Reitsch's moral choices, she never killed a child. She never made anyone else pay with their life for her commitments. Eva Braun also presents a striking contrast, though in a different way. Eva was, in the final analysis, a woman of very limited power, someone whose entire significance derived from her relationship with Hitler and who exercised that relationship almost entirely in the private rather than the public sphere. She is sometimes portrayed as a victim, someone trapped in a relationship with a man of overwhelming presence and personality who ultimately offered her nothing but his company and finally his name for a few hours before their deaths. There is some truth to this characterization, but there is also evidence that Eva Braun was, within the limits of her world, genuinely happy with the life she had. She skied, she swam, she photographed, she socialized with the small circle of people who knew of her relationship with Hitler. She did not seek a larger world, and she did not appear to suffer from the limitation of her circumstances. The contrast with Hanna Reitsch could not be more complete. Hanna sought the largest possible world, the sky in all its dimensions, the frontier of aviation, the edges of what was possible. She had no interest in the private sphere that Eva Braun inhabited. The idea of defining herself through a relationship, of existing as someone's companion rather than as someone in her own right, would have been incomprehensible to her. She was, in this respect, a genuinely modern figure in a way that most of the women of the Nazi world were not. She had made herself entirely and without apology through her own effort and her own courage. Whatever we think of the uses to which she put that self-making, the self-making itself was real and remarkable. Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, is another figure worth considering in this comparative context. Ilse was, like many Nazi wives, someone whose significance was almost entirely derived from her husband's position. She had joined the Nazi Party early in 1921, and she had remained loyal to its ideology throughout the war, and indeed throughout her post-war life. After her husband's solo flight to Scotland in May 1941 and his subsequent imprisonment, Ilse Hess devoted herself to advocating for his release, corresponding with supporters of the Nazi cause, and maintaining the memory of the regime. She lived until 1995, dying at the age of 90. And she never publicly repudiated the ideology she had embraced in the 1920s. She represents the most straightforward form of female Nazi, the true believer whose loyalty was total and whose accountability in post-war Germany was minimal. Hanna Reitsch's case is, as we have argued throughout this video, in a different category from all of these women. She is the opposite of every female Nazi in the sense that none of the categories that apply to the others apply straightforwardly to her. She was not a domestic figure. She was not defined by a man. She was not a perpetrator of direct violence. She was not an ideological enthusiast of the Goebbels or Schultz-Klink stamp. She was not a passive bystander. She was something the Nazi regime had no conceptual framework for, an independent woman of exceptional professional achievement who chose, through a combination of patriotism, passion, and perhaps a certain deliberate narrowness of focus, to place that achievement in the service of the regime. The question of whether Hanna Reitsch's story is ultimately one of extraordinary courage or of moral failure or both simultaneously is one that each viewer must answer for themselves. The evidence does not point unambiguously in one direction. She was genuinely brave, in a way that few people in history have been brave. She flew aircraft that killed experienced pilots. She flew into burning Berlin. She tested suicide weapons. These things required a kind of physical courage that is not in dispute. She was also a servant of a criminal regime who accepted its highest honours and appears to have maintained an admiration for its leader that survived, at least until his death, the revelation of the full extent of his crimes. These things also require acknowledgement. What is clear is that she was unique. No other woman in the Nazi world occupied the position she occupied, combining exceptional professional achievement with genuine proximity to the highest levels of the regime, surviving everything the war threw at her, and then living long enough to become a contested figure in the historical memory of the Third Reich. She is the opposite of every female Nazi, not because she was innocent, but because she was a different kind of person altogether. Someone who defied every category the regime's own ideology created for women, and yet served that regime with distinction. The paradox at the heart of her story is not one that resolves neatly. It requires us to hold complexity rather than to reach for simplicity. She also remains, in the 21st century, a figure of significance for people interested in the history of aviation. The records she set, the aircraft she flew, the specific technical contributions she made to German aeronautical development in the 1930s and 1940s, these are part of the history of flight in a way that is entirely independent of their political context. The Fokker Achilles helicopter demonstration of 1938 was a landmark event in aviation history. The Me-163 test flying was at the absolute frontier of what human beings and aircraft could do. The development of the Reichenberg, whatever its moral implications, represented a significant chapter in the history of guided weaponry. Hanna Reitsch was at the centre of all of these developments. For the aviation world, she represents something specific and important, the possibility of excellence at the extreme edge of human capability. The test pilots of the 1930s and 1940s were doing something that has no real equivalent in the modern world, operating at the boundaries of physical and technical knowledge with inadequate equipment, incomplete understanding, and the certain knowledge that mistakes would be fatal. Of that extraordinary cohort, Hanna Reitsch was among the best. She flew more aircraft types, survived more serious accidents, and accumulated more experience on experimental aircraft than almost any other pilot of her era. The fact that she did this while female in a world that had not designed any of the systems or structures she was operating within for someone of her gender makes the achievement even more striking. She also paradoxically represents the limits of personal excellence in the face of systemic evil. Her individual gifts were extraordinary. Her moral clarity was not. She excelled at the technical mastery of aircraft and failed to apply the same rigour to the political world in which those aircraft operated. This is, of course, a human failing. Most people are better at the immediate and practical than at the abstract and systemic. The mechanic who keeps the extermination camp's crematoriums running is not thinking about the camp's purpose, he is thinking about the machinery. Hanna Reitsch was thinking about the aircraft, but she was not an ordinary mechanic. She was one of the most celebrated figures in the entire German war effort, someone with access to the highest levels of the regime, someone whose judgment and whose example genuinely mattered. The failure of moral clarity in such a person has a different weight than it does in an anonymous participant in the system. And so we are left with a story that resists resolution. Hanna Reitsch was brave and complicit, gifted and culpable, extraordinary and fallible. She flew into the fire because she could, because no one else would, because the sky was her element, and she was never more herself than when doing what no one else could do, and she flew in the service of a regime that was burning the world. Both of those things are true. Both will remain true. The woman who was the opposite of every female Nazi was also, in the most fundamental sense, a product of Nazi Germany, someone whose greatest achievements were made possible by the regime and its investments, someone whose image was used in its service, someone who returned, in its final hours, to place herself at its very centre. The sky over Germany, over Berlin in those last terrible days of April 1945 must have been a strange and terrible place. The bombers of the Allied air forces had been turning the city's landmarks into rubble for months. Below, on the ground, the Soviet artillery was creating a landscape of fire and death. And through it all, threading between the burning buildings and the anti-aircraft fire, flew a small training aircraft carrying 2 people. One of them Germany's greatest female aviator, flying with the absolute precision of someone for whom the mechanics of flight had become as natural as breathing. She flew out of that burning city alive. She carried with her the memories of what she had seen, and she carried those memories for 34 more years until her heart finally gave out on a summer day in Frankfurt in 1979. Whether she deserved to carry those memories in freedom, whether justice was served by her release without charge in 1946, whether the humanitarian work of her later years represented genuine redemption, or merely the continuation of a life that had always been oriented towards self-expression rather than moral accountability, these are questions that have no definitive answers. What is not in question is that her story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the Second World War. The woman who flew into burning Berlin was, in every sense that matters, the opposite of every female Nazi. And she was, in every sense that matters, one of them too. There is a broader lesson in Hanna Reitsch's story that goes beyond the specific historical context of Nazi Germany. It is a lesson about the relationship between exceptional talent and moral responsibility, about the ways in which passionate commitment to a craft or a calling can narrow the moral field of vision, about the dangers of patriotism that does not pause to ask what exactly the nation is doing with the service it is being offered. It is a lesson about how extraordinary people can make ordinary moral failures, and how those failures, in an extraordinary context, can contribute to catastrophic outcomes. And it is a lesson about the inadequacy of categories, about the way that real human beings, in all their complexity, refuse to fit neatly into the moral frameworks we construct to make sense of the past. Hanna Reitsch was born in a mountain town in Silesia in 1912 and died in Frankfurt in 1979. Between those 2 dates, she flew hundreds of different aircraft types in conditions that would have defeated most pilots. She set records, survived crashes, received medals, flew into the eye of history's greatest catastrophe, lived to tell about it, built flying schools in West Africa, competed in international soaring competitions, and died as one of the most complex and contested figures in the history of the Second World War. She was the opposite of every female Nazi. She was unlike any pilot who had ever lived. She was utterly, completely herself, and she served the Third Reich with dedication and distinction. All of these things are true. All of them are part of her story. None of them, taken alone, are enough. Well, that is the story of Hanna Reitsch, one of the most remarkable and deeply complicated women in the history of the Second World War. If you want to learn more about the extraordinary women who inhabited the world of Nazi Germany, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we explore the very different paths taken by the women who were defined by their relationships with the men at the center of the regime. We also have a fascinating video on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders, tracing the lives of the sons and daughters who grew up in the shadow of the most notorious figures in modern history. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming content on the Second World War and the remarkable people who lived through it. Thank you for watching. The broader question of how Nazi Germany's aviation program exploited women's talents while simultaneously denying women's full humanity in every other dimension of its ideology is one that has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. Aviation was, in many respects, the one domain where the regime's practical needs overrode its ideological commitments. The Luftwaffe needed the best pilots available to test the aircraft it was developing. When the best available pilot happened to be a woman, the regime found a way to accommodate this fact without drawing the obvious conclusion that its gender ideology was wrong. Hanna Reitsch was the most prominent example of this accommodation, but she was not the only one. Melita von Stauffenberg, whose story we have touched on already and who deserves more detailed consideration, was in many ways Hanna's closest comparable in the German wartime aviation world. Born Melita Schiller in 1903 to a partly Jewish family in Krotoschin, she had always been aware of the tension between her identity and the ideology of the state she served. She was a brilliant engineer and pilot, holding 2 doctorates and accumulating more than 2,000 test flights during the war, many of them in Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, dive bombers, at extreme angles that she maintained for longer than any other pilot had previously managed, in order to gather data on the effects of prolonged negative gravity on the aircraft's systems and on the human body. She was decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, just as Hanna was. She was, by the technical standards of her profession, one of the finest test pilots in the world. But Melita's position was fundamentally different from Hanna's in one crucial respect. She knew with absolute certainty what the regime she was serving was capable of, because the regime had specifically targeted people like her. Her partly Jewish ancestry had required years of bureaucratic manoeuvring, the personal intervention of senior Luftwaffe officers, and ultimately a special certification as an Aeronaria, an honorary Aryan, to enable her to continue her work. She flew for a regime that would have killed her grandmother, and she knew it. And when her brother-in-law Klaus von Stauffenberg began planning the operation that would culminate in the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler, Melita was aware of what was happening. She supported it, not actively but with the tacit knowledge and the quiet, practical assistance that was possible for someone in her position. After the plot failed and Klaus and his co-conspirators were executed, Melita was arrested by the Gestapo and interrogated. She survived, was released, and continued her test flying until April 8, 1945, when her aircraft was shot down by an American P-51 Mustang over Bavaria. She died of her wounds the same day, just 3 weeks before the end of the war in Europe. Melita von Stauffenberg's story represents, in some sense, the road not taken by Hanna Reitsch. Both women had the skill, the courage, and the proximity to the Nazi leadership that would have made resistance meaningful if they had chosen to pursue it. Melita's particular circumstances made resistance not just possible, but, in some sense, personally urgent. Hanna's circumstances were different. She had no Jewish ancestry. She had no family members in the resistance. She had no personal stake in the regime's destruction. And she had, as we have noted, a relationship with the regime and its leader that appears to have been genuinely warm, rather than merely professionally expedient. These differences are real, even if they do not fully resolve the comparative moral judgment. The question of courage in this context takes on a different shape than it does in the purely technical domain. Physical courage Hanna Reitsch had in superabundance. She was, by the evidence of her entire career, almost constitutionally incapable of responding to physical danger with anything other than heightened focus and determination. But moral courage, the willingness to act in accordance with one's deepest ethical commitments, even when the cost is high, is a different thing. Melita demonstrated moral courage of a high order by maintaining her tacit support for the resistance, knowing what the consequences of discovery would be. Hanna, by contrast, never deviated from her service to the regime. She was loyal to Germany, loyal to Hitler, loyal to the cause of German aviation, through everything. Whether this loyalty was a form of moral failure or a form of tragic fidelity to values that had been formed before the full evil of the regime was apparent, is a question that admits of no easy answer. It is worth reflecting also on the specific question of what Hanna Reitsch thought about the prospect of Germany losing the war. From the evidence of her behaviour in the final months of the conflict, it appears that she understood by late 1944, at the latest, that Germany was going to be defeated. The evidence for this is the Reichenberg programme itself. The advocacy for suicide tactics makes no sense unless one has concluded that conventional tactics are no longer sufficient. And conventional tactics are no longer sufficient only if the military situation is desperate. Hanna Reitsch was not a strategic analyst, but she was not stupid. She had eyes, she had access to information, she knew what was happening. And yet she continued to serve, to fly, to advocate for special operations and unconventional weapons. What does this tell us about her? It tells us perhaps that her commitment was not to victory as an outcome, but to service as a value. She was serving Germany, serving the Luftwaffe, serving the cause of aviation as the best possible expression of her particular gifts. Whether that service resulted in victory or defeat was, at some level, secondary to the fact of the service itself. This is a recognizable psychological type, the person whose identity is so thoroughly invested in a cause that the failure of the cause does not register as a reason to stop serving it. We see this pattern in other figures of the Nazi regime's final days, people who continued to function as if the apparatus of the state was still meaningful, even as that apparatus was physically collapsing around them. In most cases, this kind of commitment reads as fanaticism. In Hanna Reitsch's case, it is harder to categorize because the service she was rendering was technical rather than ideological, and because the courage with which she rendered it was genuine rather than performed. The legacy of the Reichenberg program and its aftermath also deserves a final note. The 70 or so pilots who trained for the program never flew operational missions, as we have noted, but their willingness to volunteer raises profound questions about what the experience of Nazi Germany did to young men's relationship with their own lives and deaths. They were, in many cases, experienced combat pilots who had already survived years of aerial warfare. They were not naive. They understood what they were volunteering for, and they volunteered. The program represents a kind of endpoint in the psychological trajectory of the German military aviator in the Second World War, from the confident blitzkrieg victories of 1939 and 1940, through the grinding attritional battles of the Eastern Front and the air war over Germany, to the desperate extremity of contemplating deliberate self-destruction as the only remaining tactical option. Hanna Reitsch was the person who brought this trajectory to Hitler's attention and advocated for its implementation. This fact sits in her record alongside the helicopter demonstration, and the Berlin flight, and the soaring records, and the humanitarian work in Ghana. It is part of who she was. The memory of Hanna Reitsch in Germany today is complicated. She is not celebrated in the way that, say, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron of the First World War, is celebrated. She is not the subject of national monuments or official commemorations, but she is also not forgotten, and she is not simply condemned. The aviation history community remembers her with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. Her name comes up in discussions of German wartime aviation, of helicopter development, of rocket-powered flight. She appears in museums and exhibitions focused on the history of flight. She is a figure who cannot be erased from the historical record without falsifying that record, because she was genuinely present at too many of its defining moments. There are people in Germany today, people with connections to the soaring and aviation communities, who remember her from personal encounters in the 1960s and 1970s. Some of them speak of her with straightforward admiration as a great pilot who happened to have lived in difficult times. Others are more equivocal, acknowledging her gifts while also acknowledging the context in which those gifts were deployed. Very few speak of her with the kind of uncomplicated pride with which one might speak of a figure whose legacy is unencumbered by the weight of what she served. This seems appropriate. She was not a figure whose legacy should be uncomplicated. She earned the complication by the choices she made, and those choices cannot be separated from the achievements that make her remarkable. The story of Hanna Reitsch is ultimately a story about the human capacity to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate and the personal and the professionally immediate to the exclusion of the larger moral landscape. She had a gift of extraordinary proportions, and she gave that gift entirely and without reservation to a world that she experienced as meaningful and worthwhile, a world of flight and skill and technical mastery that she had been part of since she was a teenager. That world did not ask her to think about what her service meant in the larger scheme of things. It asked her to fly. And she flew. The larger scheme of things was there. It was happening. While Hanna tested the Me-163 at Peenemünde, the Nazis were operating Auschwitz-Birkenau at its full murderous capacity less than 700 kilometers to the southeast. While she flew her helicopter indoors for the crowd at the Berlin Motor Show in 1938, the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, was less than 10 months away. While she flew into the Führer bunker in April 1945, the concentration camps were being liberated and their horrors were being seen for the first time by the world. These things and her world existed simultaneously. They were part of the same reality, even if she experienced them as separate. This is the deepest truth of her story, and it is a truth that applies not just to her, but to all of us, that the world is not compartmentalizable, that the work we do and the institutions we serve exist in a context that we cannot simply choose to ignore, and that the quality of our craft does not absolve us of the responsibility to attend to the quality of what our craft is serving. The specific circumstances of Germany's defeat and the subsequent reckoning with the Nazi period created a unique environment for survivors like Hanna Reitsch. The denazification process, which the Allied powers imposed on occupied Germany from 1945 onward, was designed to categorize former participants in the Nazi regime according to the degree of their involvement and the nature of their contribution. The 5 categories ranged from major offenders, the Hauptschuldige, who faced the most serious consequences, through lesser offenders, followers, and finally, the exonerated. Hanna Reitsch, when she went through the process, was classified in one of the lower categories. Her test flying for the Luftwaffe, her personal decorations, her presence in the bunker, none of these placed her in the class of people who had designed or implemented the regime's criminal programs. She was a participant, a celebrated one, but not in the category of the architects of genocide. This classification, while legally defensible, was unsatisfying to many who felt that the denazification categories failed to capture the moral dimension of what people like Hanna Reitsch had done. The categories were designed to identify criminal behavior and allocate legal responsibility. They were not designed to measure the degree to which individuals had enriched the regime by their association with it, had given it prestige and glamour and propaganda value that helped sustain it in the eyes of the German people and the world. In this immeasurable but real sense, Hanna Reitsch's contribution to the Third Reich was significant in a way that the denazification categories could not capture. The period from 1945 to 1951, when her memoir appeared, was one in which she was, as far as the historical record reveals, doing relatively little that was publicly visible. She was recovering from the physical and psychological shocks of the war's end. She was dealing with the restrictions on German aviation. She was, presumably, processing the revelations of the post-war period, the full documentary evidence of the Holocaust that emerged through the Nuremberg trials and the subsequent proceedings. She was also, one imagines, dealing with the personal losses that the war's end had brought, the deaths of colleagues, the destruction of the institutions and the world she had known, the disappearance of everything she had built her career within. Her memoir, when it appeared, was a remarkable document of the inner life of a woman who had lived at the extreme edge of human experience. It was also, as critics noted, a carefully constructed piece of personal rehabilitation. It presented Hanna Reitsch as she wished to be seen, as a passionate aviator whose service to Germany had been motivated by love of country and love of flight, rather than by ideological commitment, as someone who had been deceived about the full nature of the regime she served, as a person of genuine courage and integrity, whose association with the Nazi regime was a historical misfortune rather than a moral failure. Some of these claims were more plausible than others. The passion for aviation was genuine and not in dispute. The claim to have been deceived about the full nature of the regime was harder to sustain, given her access and her proximity to the highest levels of power. The presentation of her courage as a moral rather than merely physical virtue was the most contestable of all. Her memoir was nonetheless an important book, both for what it revealed and for what it concealed. The flying sequences were superb, written with the precision and vividness of someone who had spent decades translating physical experience into language. The descriptions of the Me-163, of the helicopter demonstrations, of the final flight into and out of Berlin were some of the most vivid accounts of wartime aviation ever committed to paper. They rang true because they were true, because they described things Hanna had actually done and actually felt. The political sections, the passages dealing with her relationship to the regime and to Hitler, were far less convincing, written in a register of careful qualification and strategic vagueness that contrasted sharply with the directness of the flying descriptions. The book was the work of a person who was fully honest about one dimension of her experience and much less honest about another. The reception of the memoir reflected this division. Aviation enthusiasts received it with enormous enthusiasm. Historians were more cautious. The former group focused on the flying, the latter focused on the politics. The book satisfied the former completely and the latter not at all. This pattern of divided reception would characterize Hanna Reitsch's public life for the remaining 30 years after its publication. Her life and death raise a question that extends far beyond the specific historical context of Nazi Germany. What do we owe to people of extraordinary talent who place that talent in the service of evil? Do their achievements warrant celebration independent of the context in which they were made? Do we honour the pilot while condemning the regime she served? Or does the service to the regime contaminate the achievement so thoroughly that celebration becomes impossible? These questions have no universal answers. They depend on the nature of the talent, the degree of the service, the extent of the evil, and the availability of alternatives. In Hanna Reitsch's case, the talent was very great. The service was real and publicly known and accepted with apparent pride. The evil was among the greatest in history, and the alternatives, while not easy, were not unavailable. The judgment that results from weighing these factors will differ depending on the values and priorities of the person doing the weighing. What should not happen is the judgment being made without all the evidence, without full acknowledgement of both the extraordinary gifts and the extraordinary service to evil that define her story in equal measure. She was the opposite of every female Nazi. She was also, inescapably, one of them.